So today I thought I would preach a message that, every mother wants to hear on Mother's Day. I thought I would preach from Proverbs 31. Living out Proverbs 31 in 3 easy steps and 5 minutes a day. Sound like a good Mother's Day message? Right? Yeah, we set this time aside. We talk a little bit about families, and I've discovered that most families, when they come to church, especially when they initially come to church, one of the things that they're hoping is that the church will help them build a better family. It'll make for a better family life. Their kids will be well-behaved superheroes. Everything will go miraculously well because we made it to church, which in and of itself is often an act of God. A testimony to how many young families we have in the church right now, by the way. But it's a miracle when a family gets everybody together. They get on the same page and they get to church together. But there's a lot of discussion also these days about, what a family is and what a family looks like. And, I hear a lot about, let's have a traditional family. And sometimes people, even when they're talking about a traditional family, they'll say, well, like a biblical family. Let's have a biblical family. And I sit there and I think, okay, so which family in the Bible should we aim to be like? Like the very first family in the Bible, Adam and Eve, whose only parent was God. Like, if there was ever a perfect parent, would be God, correct? So Adam and Eve, perfect parent, and by the time they have their own kids, one of them kills the other. Right? Should we try and emulate that biblical family? Like Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, or, nix the Abel part of that. Yeah, not a great plan. Or how about Noah? There's a good biblical family. Noah was a righteous man and saved his family. They all built a boat together. They lived on it. They didn't kill each other on the boat. They were in there with all the other animals. And I'm sure at some point his adolescent children probably reminded him a lot of some of the other animals in the boat. Probably hard to tell the difference, with sight and sound and smell. But Noah, surely that's a great family to emulate. Only, not only did Noah save his family, but he also cursed his grandson Canaan. Do you remember that story? Ham's son Ham was the one that committed the shameful act. He's the one that went in, saw his dad drunk and naked in the tent, and went out and started talking to his brothers about it. And his brothers were like, we need to do something about this. And they take in this covering for him, and they don't even want to look on their father's nakedness. They walk in backwards so that they're not exposed to that type of thing. And anybody that's seen a father walk around naked knows what we're talking about here. Like, this is a good thing that they were just hiding themselves from it. They cover them up and walk back out. And they're considered, honored, and they're considered blessed. But old Ham, his son gets punished for it. His son Canaan, for his shameful action. So I don't know if I really want to emulate Noah's family, but surely Abraham, like Father Abraham, like father of humanity. His very name is Father, right? Like, you would think this is the biblical archetype for what it means to be a father. But again, he nearly killed his own kid, right? Out of obedience, but still, I don't know if things were ever the same between him and Sarah after that. But not only that, even think back before that. Like, Abraham pimped out his wife twice, right? And that stuff carries forward. His son did the same thing. Practically the same group of people a generation later. You want to be like Father Abraham? You want to be married to that? Remember the mess with Isaac and Ishmael? And remember the mess between Abraham's wife and his servant, baby mama? That was a mess. You want to be like that family? I don't know if that's the family I want to be like. And it carried forward to Jacob and Esau. Remember what a mess Jacob and Esau were? Again, trying to kill each other. Well, this family sounds a lot more like my family all the time, right? Just messy and painful and filled with all kinds of weird things happening. So every once in a while, sometimes or people will ask, why do you think God chose Israel? Why was Israel God's chosen people? You ever wonder that? Like, how come it wasn't somebody else? And sometimes what I think, like, there are people that would say, well, they were chosen because they were so special. And I sit there and think, maybe they were chosen because they were a special mess. Like, did it ever dawn on you that if God could do something with Israel, he could do something with anybody, right? I mean, there's a part of me that looks at it and thinks maybe that was it. Well, we could go forward if you want. We could talk about David. We have already. We've been reading a lot of his songs and poems, and again, kind of a messed up guy. And how about Solomon, his second son with Bathsheba? Like the woman he stole, the woman he got pregnant before her own husband had died while her husband was off to war, and the woman whose husband he had killed. Well, Solomon, surely there's a dad we can emulate, right? Yeah, let's pick one of his marriages to emulate. Let's see. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Can I just say this? Men, if you're trying to decide which one's your favorite wife, you got a problem, right? Solomon had issues. He started with great wisdom early in his life, incredibly wise. You remember when God blessed him with this great wisdom, and then all of a sudden, something took a turn to the south. Like, it was like he had all this knowledge, but not a lot of wisdom towards the end of his life. Maybe that's what happens when you give yourself to, 1,000 different women. I don't know. But today we're going to read one of his songs. And I had to give you that preface because Solomon was kind of a messed up daddy. He was a messed up father. He had a messed up father. He had a mother that had been traumatized by the king. It was kind of a messy household, and yet we're going to try and learn from him. Well, before you give up hope, at least there's got to be at least one good family in the Bible, right? Like, let's go to the New Testament. Surely, like Mary and Joseph. Mary and Joseph, they had like the King of all kings, the Prince of Peace, right? Before they got married and before they, really sealed the deal. And how much do we read about Mary and Joseph later? Like, we read this time where they went to the temple together and had Jesus, dedicated. And then again later on when they make the journey again and Jesus is teaching in the temple. And by the way, they left town that time, didn't even have Jesus with them. I mean, model parents from that standpoint, right? I don't know what kind of model, but a model. And then I don't know what happens to Joseph. Did he disappear or did he die? History kind of argues about that. Most people think, well, Jesus was still a young man, Joseph died. I think if anywhere, probably the closest thing to model family we get in the Bible is maybe the Philippian jailer, right? But the only comment is how they all came to Christ, and the only identifying mark about him really is that he was a jailer. So there's just so much we don't know, but here's something that we do know, and I think plays out throughout Scripture and plays out here, and it's probably the most important thing we can really talk about today. But before I give you this principle, I want to tell you where we're going to be. We're going to be in Psalm 127 and 128. And just know that combined, these two psalms are not as long as last week's psalm. Okay? The first one only has 5 verses. But here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the builder, the bowman, and the blessing. The blessing is going to come up in Psalm 128. So we're going to do 127 and 128, and I hope you can kind of follow along with me there. So let's start with the builder. Actually, let's start with this principle first. Let's go to the next slide. So there's this principle that we're going to come back to several times a day, and it's simply this principle. Remember that when the ideal is unrealized, grace abounds. I think that's a perfect message for Mother's Day for mothers. Because we all have this ideal about how life is going to go, how marriage is going to go, how even the wedding, the courtship, the wedding, the baby. I mean, we have these 5, 10, 20-year goals of how everything's just going to happen and be ideal. But when ideal is unrealized, grace abounds. And I want you to keep that in mind as we read through these two Psalms. The first Psalm, straight from Solomon, or dedicated to Solomon. It's sometimes hard to tell. But I think this one probably actually comes from him. So let's just start with the builder. And today I'm going to throw you off. Usually I preach from the NIV. Today I'm using the Contemporary English Bible, the CEB, which is also a very good translation. Sorry, not Contemporary English, Common English Bible. But there's a word in here I think translates really well, and so I chose to use this one consistently. But let's start with verse 1 about the builder, and which is on the next slide. One more. For some reason, my remote didn't connect today either. It did right before Sunday school, but then it quit. So unless it's the Lord who builds a house, the builder's work is pointless. And that's the word I liked. Pointless. Now in the NIV, it probably says the work is in vain. Like if you build the house without the Lord, it's just in vain. It's vanity. It's wasted. It's like Solomon uses in one of his other letters in the book of Ecclesiastes. It starts off with the idea that it's just meaningless. And I think what we can pick up from Solomon here is that we just can't do it. We don't build our families. And women, I want you to hear that specifically. Moms, you feel like the weight of the entire family is on your shoulders. Sometimes it's because you just take that weight, but also it's because people love to put it on your shoulders. But understand, the building your family is not just about you and your work. I heard a person talking about this today, or this week, kind of a comedian talking about dads. He's like, this dad gets his phone call from the school. Hello? You know, he's like, and they're like, yeah, this so-and-so at little Johnny's school. Hey, do you know what bus number Johnny rides? Because Johnny seems to not know what bus he's supposed to get on, and he's not gotten on the bus. And the dad's like, now, you realize that I'm the dad, right? You're calling me for the school bus number information? Do you not have my wife's phone number in there? And they're like, well, we just called the first number we came to. You could call any other woman whose kid goes to that school and they'd have better chance of knowing what bus my son gets on than I do, right? And they're like, well, you know, could you help us out? Well, actually, the buses have left. Do you just want to come pick up Johnny? He's like, all right, I'll come to the school. I'll come get Johnny. What school does he go to? Right? This all resonates a little bit, right? Like, moms, you feel like it's all on you, but the truth is, without God's help, you're doing the work. It's pointless to even try. And I think when Solomon talks about this, I want to give you a little context. This is one of those Psalms of Ascent. This is the kind of song you sang with your family on your way to worship, right? And in that case, it wasn't sitting in the car trying to pick a song off the radio. It was walking, maybe to Jerusalem, maybe through Jerusalem, walking up to Jerusalem, and then walking up the Temple Mount, out of breath. And they're singing this song, this one and the next one both, celebrating what it means to be a family. And they're celebrating that God is building a family. And the second half of this verse, the next slide, is much like it. It says, unless the Lord protects the city, it's pointless. It's the next slide. If the Lord doesn't protect the city, it's pointless. So he's not only just talking about a family being built, but God is the builder of the city of Jerusalem. He's the builder of the temple. There's a progression there. In our case, he's the builder of our community. He's the builder of our church. Remember what Jesus said to Peter, Peter, who do people say I am? And he's like, well, some say John the Baptist. Some say, maybe, who do you say I am, Peter? Well, I think you might be the Messiah. I think you're the Messiah. And Jesus turns around, looks at him and says, Rocky, you're right. And on this rock, I will build my church. He's a builder of churches. He's a builder of families. He's a builder of communities. And I think part of what this is talking about, when it says, unless it's the Lord that protects the city, the guard on duty is pointless. I think what he's saying is, if the city's not built on good and godly principles, what's the point of protecting it? It's a mess. You know, he's talking about cultural building blocks for a God-honoring family, church, and culture, a community. And as a church, I would like to think that we are a church that anyone can come to, but when you get here, you're going to find that we stand on truth, and we stand beside our neighbors and friends. You know, we stand on the truth of the gospel and the word of God, but part of that truth is we're going to love our neighbors because they're as messed up as we are. Well, not quite, but close. Right? Let's go into verse 2. Next verse goes on to reemphasize this idea that our effort is vanity or basically meaningless. It is pointless that you get up early and stay up late, eating the bread of hard labor, because God gives sleep to those he loves. There's so many things I love about this verse. I think about when our kids were toddlers, thinking what a blessing it would have been to know that God could possibly give sleep to those that he loved. Because I don't remember sleeping when they were toddlers, right? Do you? It's like, I don't remember sleeping when they were infants. Definitely moms, you don't remember sleeping when they were infants. Remember that first night, you bring them home and you put them in their room, and like every time they breathe, did they stop breathing? Are they still breathing? I remember that. Scared to death. Was that kid going to take the next breath or not? Turn in your Bibles, if you would, to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. This idea of meaningless in so many ways defines Solomon's life. He went through so many different phases, and he started off as a wise guy. I mean, a really wise man. When God asked him what he wants, he says, I just want wisdom, which was a pretty smart thing to ask for, don't you think? And so God gave him not only wisdom, but he gave him everything else he could have wanted too. And he was rich, and he was powerful, and by the end, this is his understanding. When he writes this book of Ecclesiastes, he says, the words of the teacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What does man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? Generations come and go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets, and it hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north, and round it goes, and returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams run from, they return again, and all things are wearisome. More than one can say. We'll just stop there. I'll just say that if you're looking to have a great Mother's Day, beware of Ecclesiastes. Probably not the book you want to read for today if you're looking for encouragement. Now, eventually, he comes to a really good point that it's all meaningless except for the fear of the Lord, and to value that life that God has given us, and recognizing that it's God that gives us that life. Here at the beginning, he's just like, well, he's like you and I feel, like day after day. It's just like, the alarm goes up, we get up, stumble out of bed and stumble in the kitchen, something like that. Pour myself a cup of ambition. Yawn, stretch, try to come alive. I sound just like Dolly Parton, don't I? Yeah. That's because you're not sitting over there. But, this idea that it's just the same thing every day, over and over. It's just the same old, same old, same old, same old, same old. And it can feel that way in the family. And it can start to feel pointless that you get up early and stay up late and just eat the bread of hard labor. It's just hard work. Now for them, that bread of hard labor, they had to make that bread all the time, right? They didn't have refrigeration and the type of things that we have today. Like, their food was a daily thing for them. It was a regular thing. When was there time to sleep? Well, what Solomon recognizes here is Only time to sleep is when God actually gives you the sleep. But he will give that rest, that sleep, to the ones that honor him and love him and build on this solid foundation. That foundation is part of what provides the peace in the city or in the house, because the Lord's built it. But when we build it on our own and we try and defend it on our own, we're going to have a lot of anxiety. We're going to have a lot of fear when we don't recognize this is the Lord's family. He loves them more than I ever could. He can provide for them better than I ever will. He can take care of them in ways that I can't even begin to think of. This is the Lord's. And when you hear those things, like, let me build your home, let me build your family. It's a lot like what Jesus said in Matthew 11. It's like hearing him say, come to me. Come on, come here, come here, come here. Come to me. I'll give you rest. You're weary, you're heavy laden, you're burdened, you're struggling, you're in that daily cycle. Just, come on. Let's rest. And he does that for his beloved. I just want you to understand that the builder, he's here to build a house. He's here to build your family. He's here to build our community, our church, this community around us. He's willing and interested in that type of influence. Let's talk a little bit about the Bowman. Well, before we get there, I want to talk one more thing about verse 3. Let's go to verse 3. God blesses what he builds. In verse 3, it simply says that no doubt about it, children are a gift from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a divine reward. You know, I remember when I was growing up, we had lots of kids at school that loved to be in what used to be called, it's probably called something else now. At the time, it was called Talented and Gifted. Did you have a tag program at your schools, Talented and Gifted? What do they call that now? Like, I have no idea. Maybe that's not an acceptable. You're still gifted and talented, just not talented and gifted. Gotcha. It's a gap, not a tag. I got it. I'm shocked that they still are allowed to use a label like gifted. But I always thought it was strange that we worked hard to identify kids that were gifted, but we didn't work hard to help people recognize that kids were a gift. You know, no matter how much talent they have, no matter how valuable they seem to the community or otherwise, kids in and of themselves are a blessing. They're a gift from God. Here's something I want you to think about. The next time you're frustrated, like with your teenagers, Jake, you up there listening? Because you work with teenagers every day. Next time you're frustrated with students or with teenagers, I want you to remember this. These kids were probably an answer to a previous prayer you prayed. Right? I've been thinking about this a ton because little Mighty Max, my nephew and niece's son, who's sick, and I've told you all about that, his parents, Drew and Alyssa, tried for 10 years to have a child. And anybody that's done that, prayed for a child and gone through the struggles of infertility or gone through the pain and loss of miscarriage, anybody that's been through that, you know how painful that is. And you beg and you plead, Lord, just give me a kid. And the desire is there, at least it was for them. And I think that's part of what sustains them right now. As they've gone now through 7 weeks, now 7.5 weeks, of just sitting in the hospital room praying for their baby and doing whatever they can and feeling helpless. Well, it's a good thing they went through that training for 10 years. Oh, Lord, I want this. That's in all seriousness. But with a little bit of humor in it, it's also true for us to remember that when we're on the verge of killing that kid, you asked for that kid. God gave you that kid. God wants you to be blessed with that kid and wants you to bless that kid and not just bless them up alongside of the head like sometimes they're tempted to do, but God answered that previous prayer. Here's another thing I think we need to remember about this blessing of children. You know, the fruit of the womb is a divine reward. I think too many people just drop off that reward part and drop off the They have this idea that the fruit of the womb is divine. Like, have you ever known a parent that just thought their kids were God? Like everything. The kids dictate everything. Like they're a deity in and of themselves. And the bottom line is, kids are a gift from God, but they make terrible gods. When you let them run your life and it becomes idolatry, it's a mess. There's an Irish proverb I heard this week that says, for every mile of road, there are 2 miles of ditch. You ever think about that? Like, you got a mile of road, you got 2 miles of ditch, and you can hit either one if you want to. And I think this happens with parenting. It's like, you're driving right down the middle of the road, and all of a sudden that child just becomes the god to you. You end up in the ditch of idolatry. Like that ditch is, and it pulls you. It pulls that car to the right. You love these kids. They're your life. But you know what? That's not it. They're not your life. Your life is so much more. They're an overflow of the blessing of God in your life. And when we worship a gift of God instead of God, we get into trouble. Now, the other ditch is neglect, right? Like, I've seen parents do that too. It's like, yeah, I had the kid. I did my job. Boom. Well, that's the other. Like, I don't need to see him again. I don't need to hear from him again. They'll figure it out. Well, that's the other extreme. Somewhere in there's a road. And the path that we travel in there, it's a beautiful path, but there's a constant tension between neglect and idolatry. And it's a battle between the two. The other thing I want to just point out about this passage is, no doubt about it, children are a gift from the Lord. You know what it doesn't say there? No doubt about it, your children are a gift from the Lord. No doubt about it, my children are a gift from the Lord. And I love that this church recognizes this to be true, that there are children. Now, I'm not saying that in a weird way, like you ought to, treat everybody's kid like they're your own, but I'm saying the fact that we have children is a blessing from God. I'm so grateful to hear Thomas when he gets excited about being at church, even if I'm preaching at the time and he's running, or I'm just glad he's here, I love it when I hear a kid cry in church, except when it's Eli. I don't like hearing him cry in church, but I love hearing kids cry in church because it means that there's life in the church and we're continuing to grow and be something. These kids are a blessing. And so the other part of that is parents need a community around them. Our parents need community. And there are a lot of people right now that aren't real excited about Jesus or the church and what the church has to say or teach about Jesus. But you'd be amazed how hungry they are for a community of people that will care about them. You'd be surprised at how many kids are growing up a long way from any grandparents or even parents. There is a sense in which these children are ours. And that goes back to this principle that I just want to reiterate several times today. And that's this. Remember. It's on the next slide. Remember. When the ideal is unrealized, grace abounds. I hope and pray you don't have a biblical family like Cain and Abel or Noah or some of those families we talked about. I want you to be in a family like we just got done talking about, where that God builds on godly principles and a godly foundation that provides and protects for your family. But if that doesn't happen, remember, God's grace abounds when things aren't ideal. And it seems like more and more things aren't ideal in our world and in our families. So let's talk about the Bowman. The Bowman. Who's a Bowman? We don't have any Bowman families here. We had Bowmans in our last church, but a Bowman is an archer, right? A Bowman is an archer. And in verse 4, we figure out that God equips us for the fight. And not only does he build us, not our family, not only does he build our family, not only does he protect our city, but he equips us for the war and the fight. Children born when one is young are like arrows in the hand of a warrior. The older I get, the more I think that the emphasis is on kids when you're young, as opposed to like Robert De Niro's plan. Did you see that? That guy, that guy's older than me. I'm not ready to have kids right now. Julie is nodding her head, yes, right? Like no kid, not grandkids, all over that idea, but no kids right now. But Robert De Niro, what's he thinking? And this was a plan. This was not an oops, you know. But kids are a young man's business, so to speak, or a young person's business, right? But I don't think that's what Solomon was emphasizing. They're like arrows in the hand of a warrior. I've wondered for a lot of years, what is this really saying? Do you wonder, like, what is Solomon getting at here? For one thing, I'm not sure Solomon ever fought a battle. I mean, we read the exploits of David. They're all over. Solomon, he was a king of a different standard, you know, like he got the palace built. He built like 7 cities. He was a builder. There were still battles, I'm sure, but we don't read about him. Here's what I think. You know, arrows in the hand of a warrior. Picture a warrior with a handful of arrows. Is that warrior equipped to fight and ready to go? No, because arrows in your hand are pretty much useless. They make terrible swords, right? If you don't have a bow and you're not a bowman, what good is a handful of arrows? And there's a part of me that thinks that's what Solomon's getting at. Like, man, children are wasted on the young, so to speak. I don't think that's true, but I think that's what he's getting at. It's like, if I knew then what I know now, or if I had the experience then that I now have, now I could really give them some direction and purpose. Verse 5 goes on to kind of expand on this a little bit on the next slide. Verse 5 says that it crashed. It happens. Awesome. The person who fills a quiver full of them is truly happy. They won't be ashamed when arguing with their enemies at the gate. We'll get back to that last part. Let's talk about the first part. The person who fills a quiver full of them is truly happy. You know what a quiver is? It's where you keep the arrows. So now the arrows are no longer in the hand. They're where they belong. You're equipped for the war. And I think that's kind of what Solomon is getting at here. I think what he's saying here is that the Lord will resource and provide the tools to help build this family and to make this a special thing. See, a bowman with arrows pointed in the right direction and a bow is powerful. A bowman sends the arrows in the right direction. They're targeted. They're pointed in a direction. Think about the process. I'm not an archer, but I've shot a few arrows over the years. You load your arrow onto your bow. You draw the string back. You draw the string back, and then you release. That's the design of the whole thing, right? A couple of things about this metaphor that he gives us that I think are kind of powerful. One is this. You got to aim, right? There's got to be an aim. I think we need to make sure that we aim our kids in a good direction. We shouldn't do what like Charlie Brown did. Did you ever see this comic? Like Charlie Brown has his bow and his arrow, and he shoots, and I don't know if it's Linus comes up to him and says, "You're a pretty good shot, Charlie Brown," because he looks at the target, and every one of them's a bullseye. And Charlie Brown says, "It's not really that hard. I think anybody can do it." And he says, "Well, show me." And so he reaches back, he pulls, he fires his arrow, and then he runs down to the target and draws a circle around the arrow. He said, "I never miss." Well, yeah, but what do you hit? But I think that's how parents sometimes parent. They might let the kid be God, or they might let the kid determine the direction and where we're going to go and all that. But honestly, God gives us some direction to send our kids in, and he expects us to lead them that way. The other thing that I think we see here is that a bowman that doesn't release the arrow is worthless. Can you imagine the commander? He's, "Archers, ready! aim, fire, release, or whatever, and nobody shoots an arrow. What good is it to have archers that don't release the arrows? And this, to me, has become one of the hardest things about parenthood. It's probably because it's the season we're in. You know which season is the hardest season of parenthood? The one you're in, right? And I kind of feel that way. It's like we've released them. But no longer do we get to say yes or no. They don't ask. They quit asking a long time ago. But it doesn't do me any good to tell. The most I can hope for is a little bit of influence. The control's gone. But influence. I wanted to develop that influence. And you develop that influence when they're young. You begin to influence them in good directions. And they start to go in those directions. You try and control them all the time. All they're going to do is get out from under your control. You know? And eventually they get out from under your control, and then they don't have anything to do with you at all. But there's something about when they come back and they say, hey, can I get your suggestion here, your advice on this? I had one of those calls this week. I fainted when it came in. I had to call my son back. You know, he's like, hey, Dad, I need some advice. Boom. Called him back. What happened? Oh, I dropped the phone. Anyway, and I won't get into what it was about or whatever, but he was trying to make some decisions. And he said, what do you think? And I just said to him this, because this is the way I kind of worked with him. I was like, well, what are you thinking? And it's funny, because what he was thinking was exactly what I was thinking. He just didn't like what he was thinking, because it sounded like what I would be thinking. And he's starting to think like I did, because there was influence. When you build influence into life, you don't have to build control into the life. You begin to influence them and lead them. And so you influence the direction of that arrow, and you help point it in the right direction. And then this last one, this part of the metaphor, it's just true. It's painful but true. But you know, a bow only fires an arrow when it's under great tension. And you just ought to expect, parents, there's just going to be great tension. They're trying to become adults, even at 3 years old, sometimes it feels like. But they're trying to figure out their way in the world, and you're guiding them in it. And sometimes there's going to be a lot of tension there. And the Bible isn't going to tell you what to do in every scenario. Like, do I put them on medication for this or not? The Bible doesn't tell you that. Do I send them to private school, or do I send them to public school? The Bible doesn't tell you that. You're going to have a ton of decisions to make. The Bible doesn't necessarily tell you what to do in every scenario. But as the Bible influences you, as the Lord influences you, the Spirit influences you, you influence your children. And even then, sometimes it's not going to be ideal. And remember, when it's not ideal, grace abounds. Grace still abounds. And that's what I want to wrap up with today. I want to look at this next chapter. I don't think I put the words for this on the screen anyway. But I just want to read a blessing over us today as we begin to wrap up. This is found in the very next psalm, not necessarily written by Solomon. We don't actually know who wrote this one. But it too was a song of ascents, sung probably back to back with the song we just read. Blessed are all who fear the Lord, who walk in his ways. You will eat the fruit of your labor. Blessings and prosperity will be yours. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your sons will be like olive shoots around your table. Thus is a man blessed who fears the Lord. May the Lord bless you from Zion all the days of your life. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem, and may you live to see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel. That verse 4, thus is the man blessed who fears the Lord. With what little time we have left, I want to talk about that. Because you can trust the builder to build the house. And you can put your hands, you can let the Lord put the tools in the hands of the bowman. And you can give direction, and you can put it under tension, and you can release. And still feel like family's not a blessing at times. You may have grown up in a family like that, where your family just didn't feel like a blessing, or maybe you You're kind of in that way now. And I would just remind you with this simple truth: when the ideal is unrealized, grace abounds. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, we read the Shema about how parents should teach their children the ways, point the arrows in the right direction. In Luke 2:52, one of the few passages that talks about what it was like raising Jesus, it says Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. And these are the things that we want to happen with our kids, but what happens when it doesn't happen that way? Well, grace abounds. Let's look at Romans chapter 5. It might be a couple slides ahead. Romans chapter 5, verses 20 and 21. The law stepped in to amplify the failure, but where sin increased, grace multiplied even more. Let's pause there for a moment. You know, I don't know about you, but it seems to me the family I grew up in, the first part of this verse represents our family far more than that psalm does. You know, we didn't start as a family that the Lord was building the house. We were building in vain. We were not initially given good direction. But grace abounded. We amplified failure really well at our house. And where sin increased, grace multiplied even more. That's the hope that we have here. It's not that when your family comes to church, you're magically going to become amazing, better people. I hope that'll happen. I think it's better to live in community. But the reality is, we're probably going to help you raise your kids to be biblical families, whether we want to or not. They're probably going to turn out more like Cain and Abel, or I don't know. My parents raised Cain. My dad when he was younger, and then my mom when she was older raising me, and the kids around us. They had trouble. You're going to have trouble still, but you're going to have a community around you helping you find the grace of God in the midst of your difficult circumstances. So that's what happens. We blow it. So application, what does this look like? What's it look like for God to build your house? Your house is going to be different than mine. But here's what I know. Your house is going to need to be filled with grace. And I remember when I was first in youth ministry, families coming to me about things, you know. I was 19, 20 years old. I guess I just graduated, 21. I was 21 years old, just graduated from college, and I sit in my office, and Reggie Schuler comes in. He's got two teenagers. One's in my senior high youth group, and one's in my junior high Sunday school class. Well, their son was just as good and perfect and nice as could be, and their daughter was just running wild on him. And he came in, and he says, you know, how do I do this? What am I going to do? And being an expert who had just graduated from Bible college and was 21 years old, I gave him all the wisdom that I had from my notes. Right? Just this week, I texted Reggie, and I just said, you know, Reggie, you're a man that has always tried to pursue God's heart and just do what's right. And I love you for that, and I respect you for that. Thank you for that. We got to go through some things together. We start off, we raise these kids, we're young, we're like these arrows in the hand, and it's like, what do I do with them? As a community together, we influence one another. And I guess what I'm just saying in this is, moms, you're not alone. We're in this together. The Lord's leading. The church is in this with you. The community's in this with you. And when it all falls apart, grace abounds. Let's read the next verse, verse 21. The result is that grace will rule through God's righteousness, leading to eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord, just as sin ruled in the world. Sorry, I didn't design that slide very well. That's our goal. I hope you're not trying to raise the best soccer player in the world. Hope your kids love soccer. Hope you're not trying to, raise the best trumpet player in the world, though I love trumpet music. There's so many directions we can point our kids in. But I just encourage you to use your influence in this one. Extending the grace of God to your children so it leads them to eternal life. That's what you and I need. That's what we need to be about together. One more bonus truth here. Let's go to the next slide. You've seen this one enough, haven't you? Do you have this memorized yet? You could probably say it back to me. When the ideal is unrealized, grace abounds. All right, let's go to the next one. I think it should be the second to last. This is what I think the Lord would say to each and every one of us today. He would just simply say, I love you infinitely more than your mother. And when I wrote that line, I didn't mean he loves you more than he loves your mother. Nobody can love a kid like a mother, but God can love you even more than your own mom. And that's what we'd close with today. Just know that you're loved. Whatever today means for you, whatever you came with, whatever you leave with, would you just know that there's a God that loves you, and where all the mistakes, where all the struggle, where all the pain lives and exists, grace abounds more and more, and may it be with you in Jesus' name.